Papua, New Guinea, December 1942. The air is thick, wet, and heavy with decayed jungle vines coil over rotting helmets. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds so dense they blur the morning light, somewhere beyond the tangled green. A faint rustle, the click of a rifle bolt, and then silence again. From the shadows, shapes begin to emerge. American soldiers, their uniforms soaked, faces hollow, eyes glazed with fever. They move like specters to the dripping undergrowth, each step sinking into black mud. Their breath forms no sound. Their rifles glisten with moisture and rust. Japanese sentries whisper among the palms. Unnerved, they call them Yurei no Haitai, the ghost soldiers, men who seem to die and return again, striking from the mist, vanishing into the swamp. By the end of that year, both armies would learn that in this jungle, victory would not belong to the strongest, but to those who could endure the slow, consuming horror of the tropics. And from that horror, a legend was born. The Americans called it the Battle for Buna. The Japanese called it something else entirely, a haunting. The year 1942 was one of collapse and recalibration. The Pacific had turned into a vast graveyard of ships, men, and empires. 6 months earlier, Japan's flag had risen over Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Its armies swept through Southeast Asia with the speed and precision of a machine long prepared for conquest. From Tokyo, the Imperial High Command saw only one barrier left between its empire and complete control of the South Pacific: Australia. Australia lay beyond the Coral Sea, vulnerable, isolated, and vital to Allied survival. If Japan could sever that lifeline, it would cripple Allied logistics across the entire hemisphere. Direct invasion was impossible. Japan lacked the shipping and manpower for a continental assault. But there was another path, through New Guinea, a long, narrow island stretching like a broken blade north of Australia. At its southeastern tip sat Port Moresby, a small harbor town that commanded the Coral Sea approaches. Take Moresby, and the Japanese could threaten northern Australia with bombers and block Allied supply routes. Lose it, and the Allies would have a base to strike back toward the Philippines. That small coastal town, half swamp and half jungle, would become the hinge on which the Pacific pivoted. After the failed Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the disaster at Midway in June, Japan's naval momentum fractured. Denied a seaborne invasion, imperial planners turned to land. They chose the overland route across the Owen Stanley Range, mountains rising over 13,000 feet, cut by a thin native footpath called the Kokoda Track. It was a decision born of desperation and pride. No army had ever crossed that range with heavy weapons, yet the Japanese believed spirit could overcome geography. The first detachments of Japan's South Seas Detachment, veterans of Rabaul and Guam, landed on New Guinea's north coast in July 1942. They advanced southward through steaming rainforest, carrying rifles, mortar, and dreams of reaching the sea. Facing them were a few hundred Australian militia, young men, many still teenagers, hastily trained, poorly supplied, and already sick with malaria. They would become the first to test the myth of Japanese invincibility. For months, the fighting along the Kokoda Track seesawed from ridge to ridge. Combat here was primitive and intimate, men firing at shadows 10 meters away, bayonets flashing in rain that never stopped. Casualties disappeared into the jungle, unrecovered, decomposing in hours. Flies became constant companions. The air stank of sweat, gunpowder, and rot. Both sides learned the same truth. In this green hell, logistics mattered more than courage. Without food or medicine, even the strongest would rot from within. By September 1942, Japan's offensive had burned out on the slopes overlooking Moresby. Their troops, gaunt and starving, could see the lights of the Allied base below but could not take it. The Australian counterattack pushed them back, yard by yard, through the same deadly terrain. Yet retreat was not surrender, it was relocation. The Japanese dug in on the north coast, building bunkers at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda. They turned the beaches into fortresses of coconut logs, coral, and steel barrels, unseen from the air, nearly indestructible from the ground. When the first American units arrived, they were not ready for what waited. The 32nd Infantry Division, fresh from training camps in Wisconsin and Michigan, found themselves fighting in a world where compasses failed and boots dissolved. The rain came in sheets, the mud swallowed vehicles, and supply lines vanished under vines. Soldiers hacked paths with machetes, sleeping on waterlogged ground, waking with leeches clinging to their skin. Their weapons rusted overnight, rations spoiled before reaching the front. Yet the order was clear: drive the Japanese from the New Guinea coast, no matter the cost. In those first days at Buna, many Americans believed they faced an invisible enemy. Shots came from trees, from ground that seemed empty. When they charged, bunkers appeared where there had been nothing but foliage. Bodies vanished before burial parties could reach them. The jungle itself felt alive, conspiring against them. Rumors spread of Japanese soldiers who never slept, who blended with the forest, who moved like ghosts. But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Both armies were disintegrating inside, a living organism that devoured everything human. And soon, this disease-ridden battleground would give birth to one of the most brutal land campaigns of the entire Pacific War. The men of the 32nd Division had just arrived. Their baptism by fire and fever was about to begin. They had come expecting a battle. What they found was an environment that devoured men before bullets ever reached them. By mid-November 1942, the American 32nd Infantry Division had taken its position near the coastal outposts of Buna and Gona. The Japanese had been there for months, digging in, their engineers crafting a defensive system the Allies had never faced before. Every position was a spider's web of interlocking bunkers, built from coconut logs, earth, and steel drums packed with sand. The walls were thick enough to stop machine gun fire. Every opening was camouflaged, each bunker connected to another by narrow trenches invisible beneath the vines. It was not a front line, it was a maze of death. Above it all, the jungle canopy trapped the smell of decay. The air never moved. Corpses, friend and foe alike, sank into the swamp before they could be buried. The humid heat bloated them in hours. Insects ruled here. Even officers stopped brushing them away. The soldiers joked darkly that the jungle would eat them before the Japanese ever could. The Japanese troops, cut off from supply since August, were starving. Yet they held their positions with terrifying discipline. Rations were down to a handful of rice a day. Many drank swamp water to stay alive. They scavenged enemy corpses for food, stripped ammunition from the dead, and still refused to yield an inch. For them, Buna was not merely a defense, it was redemption. After the defeats at Coral Sea and Midway, the Imperial Army needed a symbol of endurance, something to prove the Emperor's soldiers could not be broken. For the Americans, it was their first large-scale ground battle against the Japanese. Their training, built on European-style maneuvers, meant little here. Machine guns jammed with mud. Mortar shells failed to explode in the damp earth. Artillery could not be brought forward through the swamp. Even their maps were wrong. The terrain constantly shifted with the rain. Men stumbled for hours only to find themselves a few hundred yards from where they began. Disease became the silent killer. Malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire. Dysentery left soldiers too weak to hold rifles. Tropical ulcers ate into flesh that never dried. Within weeks, half the division was unfit for combat. The few who remained found themselves fighting not only the enemy, but their own bodies among them. A legend began to spread. Patrols sent into the jungle for reconnaissance would vanish for days, then return, gaunt, filthy, and haunted, carrying stories of howling in the trees, of enemy eyes that never blinked. They spoke of Japanese soldiers appearing without sound, bayonets flashing in the dark, disappearing before a shot could be fired. Soon, the Japanese themselves began to whisper. They believed the Americans who kept returning from the swamp were not men at all, but Yurei ghosts who could not be killed. The truth was simpler, but just as chilling. The Americans who survived patrols did so by becoming part of the jungle. They painted their faces in mud, moved silently, learned to sense rather than see. They shed every trace of civilization. One soldier later wrote, "We stopped being soldiers, we were animals that walked upright with rifles in our hands." Above them, General Douglas MacArthur, now commanding the Allied campaign from Port Moresby, demanded results. He needed victory in New Guinea to restore Allied morale and secure his promise to return to the Philippines. He called Buna a hard nut to crack, but crack it we must. His words reached the front through thin radio static and weary officers, who knew their men were already at the edge of collapse. Still, the attacks continued. Wave after wave was sent against invisible bunkers. The ground gave no shelter. Every tree concealed a machine gun. Every clearing was mined. American soldiers advanced knee-deep in water, crawling beneath fire so close they could hear the shouts of Japanese defenders above them. Men died without ever seeing who killed them. By December, the battlefield had transformed into a nightmare tableau: smoke, rain, and human wreckage scattered between palms. The Japanese refused to retreat. The Americans refused to stop. It was no longer a campaign of tactics, but a test of endurance, of who would break first under the pressure of starvation, disease, and exhaustion. For both armies, the line between life and death had dissolved into the fog. The men of Buna were no longer fighting for territory or strategy. They were fighting to prove that something inside them still existed, something that could not be erased by the jungle. And soon, the world would witness what that kind of desperation looked like. A battle that would scar every survivor and haunt the Japanese army for years to come. At Buna, men ceased to resemble the clean, confident soldiers who had boarded ships months earlier. Here, in the steaming heart of Papua, they became hollow-eyed figures wrapped in torn fatigues. The jungle stripped them bare, not only of comfort, but of identity. Every breath was heavy with rot. Rations arrived moldy or never arrived at all. Water was filtered through socks, thick with mud and mosquito larvae. Every man carried the sour smell of infection, a blend of sweat, blood, and the sweet sick odor of decay. Feet swelled and split open. Leeches hung from ankles like black ribbons. When soldiers slept, ants crawled across their mouths, drawn by the salt of their lips. Death came silently and without spectacle. A man could slump under a tree from exhaustion and never wake. Others vanished into the swamp, their bodies swallowed by water and roots. Burial details stopped trying to recover the dead. The ground itself refused them. The jungle became one vast, unmarked grave. Fear of the unseen enemy warped every mind. A rustle in the ferns could mean a snake or a sniper. Men fired at shadows until ammunition ran low. In the dark, imagination became the most lethal weapon, turning every tree stump into a threat. Some soldiers spoke to the jungle as if it could hear them. Others wandered off alone, muttering, and never returned. Letters home went unwritten. Even words felt useless here. They couldn't capture the sound of the rain that never stopped, or the color of the sky that never cleared. A few men kept journals, pages mottled with mildew. One wrote, "I think we are ghosts already. We move, we fight, but something of us is gone." The Japanese endured the same nightmare, but with fewer resources. For them, surrender was forbidden. Honor demanded death before capture, and so starvation was accepted as fate. Many Japanese soldiers died clutching empty rice tins or letters to families they would never see again. Their discipline remained terrifying, even when their bodies failed. One captured soldier weighed barely 80 pounds. He had fought for 10 days without food. When asked why, he replied through an interpreter, "Because my emperor had not told me to stop." In that single sentence lay the entire madness of the Pacific War. Two armies locked in a struggle that had long ceased to be strategic, driven instead by faith, fear, and endurance beyond reason. Far from the swamps, decisions were made in rooms untouched by mud or fever. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, had built his reputation on confidence and control. He saw New Guinea as his proving ground, the first step in fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." But at Buna, his vision met the limits of nature itself. MacArthur demanded rapid progress. He believed that no strong Japanese force remained after earlier clashes, trusting flawed intelligence reports that described Buna as lightly defended. From his headquarters in Port Moresby, 150 miles away, he pressed his commanders to attack, believing boldness would compensate for hardship. What he could not see, and what few could imagine, was that his men were trapped in terrain that nullified every advantage of training, numbers, and firepower. On the ground, Major General Edwin Harding, commander of the 32nd Infantry Division, faced an impossible choice: obey orders and send his weakened troops into fortified death traps, or delay and risk MacArthur's wrath. He chose to fight. The result was carnage. Companies melted away in single afternoons. Entire platoons disappeared into swamps trying to flank bunkers that could not be seen. When Harding reported that his men were too sick and weak to continue, MacArthur dismissed it as defeatism. He replaced Harding with Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, a man known for discipline and obedience. When Eichelberger arrived at the front, the sight stunned him. He later wrote, "It was not an army, it was a collection of ghosts. The men had no dry uniforms, no clean water, no rest. They stared through him with eyes that had seen too much." Yet MacArthur's orders were clear: take Buna or don't come back alive. It was not rhetoric, it was an ultimatum. Eichelberger reorganized the lines, brought in Australian engineers, and forced every officer to the front. He slept in the mud beside his soldiers, contracting tropical ulcers and malaria himself. Slowly, painfully, the offensive regained momentum. Eichelberger's leadership gave the exhausted Americans one last fragment of cohesion, but the cost was staggering. To advance a few hundred yards, dozens died. To capture a single bunker, entire squads were erased. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Yamagata Hari had died months earlier during the retreat across the Owen Stanleys, leaving fragmented command structures behind. The local garrisons at Buna and Gona were effectively on their own. Their leaders, Major Tsukamoto and Captain Yasuda, refused surrender, insisting that death in place was the only acceptable outcome. For them, Buna was not strategy, it was sacrifice. This clash of wills, MacArthur's pride versus Japanese fanaticism, created a battlefield where logic no longer applied. Orders were absolute, even when reality contradicted them. In this way, leadership on both sides turned the jungle into a machine of annihilation. By late December 1942, the men at the front, starved, fevered, and half insane, had become living instruments of their commanders' convictions. They were no longer fighting for generals or flags, but for the faint, almost forgotten instinct to survive. And in that final stage of the battle, survival itself would become the rarest victory of all. The Battle of Buna was not fought with advanced machines or decisive weapons. It was fought with equipment that failed, metal that rusted, gunpowder that clumped in the rain, and vehicles that sank where roads did not exist. When the Americans landed in Papua, they brought the tools of a mechanized army designed for Europe. They had M1 rifles, Thompson's submachine guns, mortar, and light tanks, all impressive on open ground in the jungle. These weapons turned into burdens. Tanks bogged down within minutes, their treads swallowed by swamp water. Machine guns jammed with wet sand. Mortar rounds fizzled in the damp. Even maps disintegrated in soldiers' hands. The tropical heat corroded every bolt. Oil thickened into sludge. Rifle barrels warped from constant moisture. Soldiers began improvising, using bayonets as shovels, knives as screwdrivers, and empty ration tins as signal mirrors. They wrapped rifles in waxed paper and prayed it would keep the rust at bay for another day. The Japanese, too, fought with failing tools. Cut off from supply, they repurposed Allied ammunition, stripped metal from wrecked aircraft, and turned oil drums into armor plating. They built their bunkers with a kind of brutal genius, low to the ground, curved to deflect grenades, invisible under ferns. American bombs dropped from the air simply bounced off or buried themselves harmlessly in mud. In this way, primitive craftsmanship outmatched modern technology. When tanks finally reached Buna, the soldiers discovered their tracks could not cross palm log defenses, men had to crawl ahead to guide them through gaps. While under fire, many were crushed by their own vehicles, unseen in the sludge. A young officer wrote in his report, "The jungle doesn't fight you directly. It just waits for you to fail. Every weapon here degraded. Except one, the human body. And even that was failing fast." Modern warfare doctrine crumbled inside the New Guinea jungle. At Buna, tactics were reduced to primal adaptation. In Europe, commanders spoke of lines and flanks. In Papua, there were none. Visibility rarely exceeded 20 meters. A man could walk past an entire enemy position without knowing it. Communication lines snapped constantly. Radios malfunctioned, batteries died, and runners vanished between trees. Orders took hours to reach the front, and by then the situation had already changed. So the soldiers made their own rules. They learned to fight without seeing. They crawled through waist-deep water, feeling for wires and trip mines with their bare hands. They advanced by inches, throwing grenades at every sound, burning foliage with flamethrowers when it was available or torches when it wasn't. Some units began fighting at night, using the moon's reflection on wet leaves to navigate. Others stripped to shorts and boots, painting their skin in mud to blend with the earth. The Japanese excelled at concealment. Their bunkers were silent until the last moment. Then came a burst of fire, a grenade, and silence again. They used snipers hidden in trees to draw attention, then ambushed flanking units from below. Their discipline in the jungle was unmatched. No movement, no speech, only the rhythm of insects to betray them. To the Americans, it was as though the forest itself shot back. When reinforcements finally arrived, elements of the Australian 18th Brigade, the battle began to shift. The Australians, hardened from the Kokoda campaign, brought experience in jungle fighting. They taught the Americans how to mark cleared paths, how to use fire and smoke as cover, how to conserve strength instead of charging blindly. They shared a single brutal rule: kill the bunker, not the man. By late December, tactics evolved from chaos to method. Instead of frontal assaults, Allied troops encircled positions, cutting off each bunker like a tumor. Flamethrowers cleared interiors, grenades sealed them shut. Progress came meter by meter, at a cost of lives that seemed endless. What emerged from this learning curve would shape every future battle in the Pacific, from Tarawa to Okinawa. The Americans had learned how to fight in the jungle, but only by becoming what the jungle demanded: silent, patient, and merciless. By the final weeks of the battle, morality had dissolved as completely as the maps. The line between human and animal thinned with every day of survival. Hunger and exhaustion bred cruelty. Prisoners were rare. Mercy was rarer. Both sides, consumed by disease and paranoia, began seeing the enemy not as men but as obstacles to annihilate. One soldier later admitted, "We didn't hate them anymore, we just wanted them gone, so we could rest." Japanese soldiers, isolated and starving, committed suicide in groups rather than surrender. They wrote farewell notes to families, hung them from branches, and pulled grenades to their chests, Those captured were often delirious, some weeping. Others begging for water they could no longer swallow. Among Americans, compassion flickered and died. They had seen friends rot before their eyes. They had smelled death until it became a part of them. Every sense of honor was replaced by instinct. A chaplain at Buna wrote later in his diary, "God seemed far away here. The jungle had its own gods, hunger, heat, and silence." This moral erosion was not unique to Buna. It would echo across every island of the Pacific. The closer men fought, the more intimate the killing, the less human the war became. By 1943, both sides had stopped seeing the other as soldiers and began calling them creatures, rats, apes, or ghosts. In this language lay the justification for everything that followed. The Battle of Buna revealed not just the limits of human endurance, but the corrosion of conscience that war brings when survival becomes the only objective. It taught generals how to win, and it taught soldiers what winning really cost. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1943, the jungle did not grow quiet. It whispered endlessly through the trees, the sound of something lost that could never be found again. Buna, Papua New Guinea, December 1942. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the steaming earth. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, turning every trench into a river of filth. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, rot, and human decay. For weeks, both armies had fought to exhaustion, yet the line still had not moved. Then came the order. MacArthur's words crackled through the radio at Eichelberger's command post. "There will be no more withdrawal. Take Buna. Whatever the cost." The cost began immediately. At dawn, artillery thundered from the rear, short bursts, shells landing among the trees. Flamethrower teams crawled forward through waist-deep mud. Every step was agony. Every movement drew fire. Machine guns erupted from hidden pits, invisible except for the flicker of muzzle flashes. Men dove into the swamp for cover, choking on black water. Some never surfaced again. The Japanese had transformed Buna into a fortress of nightmares. Their bunkers, disguised beneath palm leaves, were nearly invisible. Each was a death trap, interlocking fields of fire, overlapping arcs that covered every approach behind them. Soldiers waited in silence, emaciated, fevered, but unbreakable. They had sworn to die where they stood, and most would. The Americans advanced in small squads. Flamethrowers roared. Bathing bunkers in liquid fire, grenades followed. Exploding inside enclosed spaces with thunderous cracks, the jungle burned in patches, columns of smoke twisting up into the endless rain. When fire met water, the air filled with hissing steam and the smell of scorched wood and flesh. Every few yards, the attack stalled. Communication lines failed. Men shouted through the din, their voices drowned by the storm. Medics crawled through the mud, dragging wounded men by their webbing straps, whispering prayers that were lost to the rain. Casualty clearing stations overflowed, makeshift tents filled with the dying, their eyes glazed, their bodies trembling from fever. There was no clean water, no morphine left. Doctors cut away infected flesh with pocket knives, cursing the humidity that turned every wound septic. And still, the attacks went on. There was no other way. Each bunker destroyed was another few meters gained. Each meter cost blood. By mid-December, Eichelberger's forces, aided by Australian engineers and fresh supplies, began to press deeper into Buna village. The jungle, once thought impassable, now trembled with continuous combat. Grenades echoed through the trees like distant thunder. Ammunition ran low, and soldiers scavenged from the dead. Even Japanese rifles were taken and used when American weapons failed. In the midst of chaos, acts of impossible courage unfolded quietly. A medic named Desmond T. Doss, later famous in Okinawa, was not here yet, but his predecessors at Buna carried men through swamp fire, unarmed and unprotected, their bodies riddled with shrapnel. Others refused evacuation, choosing to stay with their companies. They were not driven by patriotism or glory, only by the grim logic that leaving meant dying alone. By Christmas, the battlefield had become a landscape from nightmare. Palm trees lay shredded by artillery. The beaches were littered with bloated corpses, some Japanese, some American, indistinguishable in the decay. The tide washed over them twice a day, carrying away fragments of uniforms, helmets, and dog tags. The jungle was silent except for flies and the faint groan of the wounded. For the Japanese, there was no escape. Their last supply line had been cut by Allied aircraft. They fought without food, without medicine, surviving on roots and coconut water. Yet their will did not break. Each position had to be annihilated before the Americans could advance. Prisoners taken were few. Most chose suicide, clutching grenades or stepping into gunfire deliberately. Eichelberger watched the slaughter from his forward post, drenched in rain. His face streaked with mud, he later recalled. There were no heroes at Buna. There were only survivors. The Japanese command still refused to retreat. Tokyo radio broadcast reports of heroic resistance and glorious sacrifice. But inside those bunkers, men were dying of dysentery, malaria, and despair. They whispered prayers into the mud, calling on gods and emperors who would never answer in the end. It was not the enemy that defeated them. It was the jungle itself. On December 31, 1942, as the year gasped its final hours, Allied forces stormed the last major defensive line at Buna Mission. Flamethrowers cleared the bunkers one by one. Rifle fire echoed through smoke so thick it blotted out the sun. When it was over, the surviving Japanese, a handful of skeletal men, staggered out. Their hands raised, eyes empty. They had fought to the end of endurance. For the Americans, victory tasted of nothing. They had won the ground, but lost nearly everything else. Thousands lay dead or dying, and the survivors stared blankly at the ocean. Too weak to celebrate, a correspondent wrote that night. There was no cheer, no triumph, only silence and the rain. But the battle was not quite over. To the west, near Sanananda, another pocket of Japanese resistance still held out. The Americans would have to face one final test before the campaign ended. One last descent into the same living nightmare that had already consumed so many. And in that final push, the term jungle ghosts would take on its full haunting meaning. Sanananda, January 1943. The final stand of the Japanese army in Papua had begun. The landscape was a ruin of palm stumps, mud, and shattered bunkers. The air reeked of stagnant water and smoke. Corpses lay half buried in the swamp, their faces pale beneath swarms of insects. The rain had stopped for once, but the silence was worse than the thunder. Eichelberger's exhausted men, supported by fresh Australian battalions, pushed north along the Sanananda track, the last artery leading to the sea. Behind every thicket, a hidden machine gun waited. Every foot of ground had to be earned. The soldiers no longer shouted orders. They spoke in whispers, learning the rhythm of survival in the jungle, slow, deliberate, and merciless. The Japanese defenders, about 2,000 strong, were gaunt and skeletal. They had no ammunition to spare, no food to eat, and almost no medical supplies left. But their officers forbade surrender. For them, dying in the swamp was a duty to the emperor. Their commander, General Yamagata, sent his final report to Tokyo. The men are becoming ghosts. We will hold until the end. And they did. For days, both sides fought at such close quarters that rifles became clubs. Flamethrowers hissed and roared, clearing bunkers and waves of fire. Mortar rained down through the canopy, sending wood and bone flying together. The jungle burned in small smoldering patches. The heat was unbearable, the stench indescribable. Flies rose in black clouds, feeding on everything that lived or died. American engineers cut new paths through the swamp, laying planks to drag artillery forward. The 163rd Infantry Regiment, reinforced by Australian veterans of Kokoda, led the final assault. Men waded waist-deep in water for hours, often fighting without knowing where the enemy was until the muzzle flashes appeared. When they reached a bunker, grenades went first, then fire, then bayonets. No quarter was given, and none was expected. From the air, the scene looked like madness. Aerial observers saw nothing but jungle canopy and smoke. The battle seemed swallowed by the earth itself. In truth, it was fought not on open ground, but in tunnels of mud and leaves where every step could mean death. By January 15th, the Japanese defense had fractured. Starving soldiers tried to slip through Allied lines under cover of darkness. Many drowned. In the swamp, others were cut down by patrols. Those captured were barely human, skeletal, delirious, crawling on all fours. One American officer wrote, "They didn't look defeated, they looked erased." And still, there were holdouts, tiny pockets of men who refused to die quietly. In one bunker, 40 Japanese soldiers held off. An entire company for 2 days before being silenced by flamethrowers. When the Americans entered, none were left alive. Their faces were calm, their hands still clutching rifles with no bullets left. On January 22, 1943, the battle for Buna and Sanananda was officially declared over. The Japanese 18th Army had ceased to exist. Of the 500 who had held the beaches 2 months earlier, fewer than 200 were taken prisoner. The rest lay in the jungle, unburied and unnamed. The swamp became their grave, a place where time itself seemed to stop. The Allied forces were too broken to celebrate. More than 3,000 Americans and Australians had fallen. Nearly all survivors were sick with malaria, dengue, or dysentery. Their uniforms hung in rags. Their eyes were hollow, their skin yellowed from fever. Many could not speak about what they had seen, not because of trauma alone, but because words failed to describe it. When MacArthur's staff finally inspected the battlefield, even hardened officers fell silent. Buna had been taken, yes, but at a price that stunned the Allied command. Eichelberger, standing amid the ruins, sent a brief, somber report. "We have done the impossible. Buna is no longer in enemy hands." Then he added quietly, "May God forgive the waste." The victory, though costly, marked the first major Allied triumph against Japan's ground forces. In the Pacific, it shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and proved that the tide could be turned. But for the men who fought there, it left scars that would never heal. Many would later speak of hearing voices in the jungle, whispers at night, as if the dead still lingered beneath the trees. Local villagers avoided the battlefield for years, calling it the place where ghosts breathe. Even decades later, when archaeologists and veterans returned, they found the relics, helmets, bones, rusted rifles, half swallowed by vines, as if the earth itself was trying to forget. The Battle of Buna Gona Sanananda was over, but the memory of it, the heat, the rain, the endless death, became the seed of something larger. A new kind of warfare, one fought not just against men, but against nature itself. And as the last gunfire faded, the jungle reclaimed its silence. Only the ocean's distant rhythm remained, whispering against the shore, as if to mourn both the victors and the vanished. The rain returned the day after Buna fell. It came softly at first, then in waves, washing over the trenches and the bodies that still lay where they had fallen. The smell of death rose with the steam, a mixture of mud, oil, and decay that clung to everything. For the men who survived, the silence felt unnatural. After weeks of ceaseless noise, the absence of gunfire was almost unbearable. Work began immediately. There were no ceremonies, no speeches, just shovels, stretchers, and exhaustion. Teams of engineers moved through the ruins, clearing debris and marking shallow graves. Bulldozers followed, pushing wrecked Japanese bunkers into the sea. Chaplain services were brief. a few words muttered over. The dead before the rain drowned them out. In the field hospitals, there was no rest. Hundreds of wounded men lay beneath makeshift tarps. Doctors and nurses fought against infection with little more than iodine and willpower. Every hour, someone died, not from bullets, but from the jungle itself. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers tore through the ranks faster than any Japanese assault ever had. More soldiers were evacuated sick than wounded. One medical officer wrote bitterly, "We took Buna from the enemy, but the jungle took it from us." MacArthur's headquarters celebrated the victory with restraint. He announced to the press that the campaign had ended in complete success, calling it a triumph of Allied determination. But privately, he was shaken. The battle had lasted far longer and cost far more lives than he had promised Washington. His own reputation had been on the line, and Eichelberger had salvaged it through relentless sacrifice. In his report to the War Department, MacArthur admitted that Buna was a nightmare beyond description. Still, he understood its strategic importance. The Japanese line in Papua had been broken. From now on, the Allies could move north, toward Leyte and Salamaua, and eventually toward the Philippines. For Japan, Buna was a disaster without precedent. Tokyo radio called it a temporary withdrawal, but the truth was clear to the generals in Rabaul. An entire army had been wiped from the map. The Imperial High Command realized, for the first time, that their soldiers, even the most devoted, could be destroyed through attrition and isolation. No amount of courage could defeat starvation and disease. It was the first crack in Japan's myth of invincibility. Back at Buna, the battlefield changed with every sunrise. The ocean washed away the traces of war, but beneath the surface, the wreckage remained: helmets, rifles, bones. Birds returned to the trees, singing over the ruins of human ambition. Soldiers too sick to fight were carried to transport ships bound for Australia. They left behind the friends they couldn't bury, the ghosts they would never forget. When asked what victory felt like, one survivor answered simply, "It felt like standing in a graveyard where you didn't know your own name." As reports reached the United States and Australia, newspapers hailed Buna as a turning point. They were not wrong. It was the first time in the Pacific that Allied ground forces had defeated the Japanese in a major offensive. But few civilians understood what that meant. The sanitized photographs showed smiling soldiers and raised flags, not the reality of the jungle, the stench, the fever, the way men drowned face down in mud, trying to crawl one more foot forward. Censorship concealed much of it, but the soldiers remembered. They would carry the memory of Buna for the rest of their lives. The army quickly began to analyze what had gone wrong. Commanders studied the failure of tactics, the lack of proper jungle training, and the inadequacy of supply lines. From these lessons came change, new doctrine, new equipment, new ways to fight. The U.S. Army would never again march into a jungle unprepared. Buna became a classroom written in blood. Yet even as the war machine adjusted, the men who fought there remained marked. Many were sent home, too sick to continue. Others returned to battle in New Guinea, haunted by dreams of mud and fire. Letters to families were sparse and subdued. Few spoke of heroism. Most spoke of ghosts, of men lost to the swamp who never came back, whose names were whispered but never found. The jungle had consumed an army, but in doing so, it had taught the Allies how to survive it. And that brutal education would soon be tested again, as the fight moved north toward Leyte, Salamaua, and the Solomon Islands, where the lessons of Buna would decide the fate of the Pacific campaign itself. The fall of Buna marked more than the end of a brutal campaign. It signaled a new chapter in the Pacific War, one where the myth of Japanese invincibility was finally broken, and where the Allies learned what kind of war they were truly fighting. In Tokyo, the defeat sent shockwaves through the Imperial General Staff. Reports arriving from Rabaul were fragmented and grim. Thousands of men missing. Entire units destroyed. No retreat, no rescue, just silence. To the Japanese high command, Buna was supposed to be impregnable. Its loss forced an admission that stunned even the most loyal officers. Japan could not defend every island it held. The empire's perimeter was too vast, its supply lines too thin. From now on, the war would be a slow retreat, one outpost at a time. For the men who had fought there would be no return. No body recovery, no homecoming. Their remains vanished beneath the vines and roots, reclaimed by the jungle. Years later, when Australian and American teams returned, they found bones intertwined, friend and foe indistinguishable. One soldier's rusted helmet still bore a bullet hole clean through the crown, resting beside another with Japanese kanji scratched faintly into the steel. Death had made them equals. In contrast, for the Allies, Buna became the harshest teacher of the war. The U.S. Army had entered Papua unprepared, with wool uniforms, poor rations, and commanders who had never fought in a jungle. By the end, those lessons had been burned into their doctrine. Training manuals changed. New tropical uniforms were issued. Flamethrowers, machetes, and light mortar became the standard tools of survival. Soldiers were taught to fight in small flexible units, to use the jungle instead of fearing it. The Buna model became the foundation for every island assault that followed, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. MacArthur himself learned too. He had underestimated the jungle, the weather, and the enemy's will. But he had also proven, at immense human cost, that Japan's armies could be dislodged from the ground they swore to die defending. He would carry that knowledge into the campaigns ahead. Always mindful of Buna's ghosts, when he later walked ashore at Leyte in 1944 and declared, "I have returned." Those who had been at Buna understood what that really meant, a promise paid for in blood. In Australia, the news of victory brought both relief and mourning. Families received telegrams weeks late, informing them that their sons had died of tropical illness or battle wounds sustained in Papua. Few ever learned the true circumstances. Newspapers printed photographs of smiling soldiers beneath headlines like "Victory in New Guinea." But those who returned, gaunt, fevered, and hollow-eyed, rarely smiled. Many refused to talk about what they had seen. They spoke of jungle ghosts, not as a metaphor, but as a presence, the feeling that the dead still lingered among the trees, watching, waiting, never at rest. In the United States, the victory at Buna faded quickly beneath the headlines of larger battles, Guadalcanal, Midway, Tarawa. Yet for the men who had fought there, it remained the measure of hell. They called it the worst place on earth. It became a symbol of endurance, of what soldiers could survive when stripped of everything, comfort, safety, even hope. It was not glory that defined Buna, but survival itself. For the Japanese survivors, the few who were captured, the war did not end there. They were haunted by shame, by the belief that dying would have been more honorable than living. In the decades after the war, some returned quietly to Papua. Old men, frail and stooped, searching the jungle for the bones of friends. One was found kneeling beside a rusted helmet, weeping softly, whispering, "Forgive us, we could not die as we were told to." The battlefield became a memorial of sorts, not of victory or defeat, but of futility. The jungle grew back quickly, swallowing trenches and bunkers beneath a sea of green. By the 1960s, tourists walking the beaches of Buna saw only calm waters and rusting wreckage half buried in sand. They could not imagine what had happened there. But for those who had seen it, the ghosts never left. In military academies, Buna is still studied as a case in transformation, how an army learned to adapt, how logistics and terrain can shape destiny. But beneath the strategy and analysis, one truth remains unchanged. The battle was not just fought against an enemy, but against the land itself, a war where the jungle chose who lived and who was forgotten. And even now, when the wind passes through the palms at Buna, it carries the faint, hollow echo of that war, a whisper of men who became shadows among the trees, and of a victory that cost more than anyone could bear. The Battle of Buna ended long ago, but its silence endures. In the jungles of Papua, time erases everything except memory. The vines have reclaimed the trenches. Roots curl through the rusted frames of bunkers. The ocean still touches the sand where so many fell, calm now and different. Only the wind seems to remember the cries that once filled this place. Buna was not the largest battle of the Second World War, nor the most famous. But it revealed something raw, the breaking point of human endurance. It stripped away every illusion of glory and showed war for what it truly was: mud, fever, exhaustion, and the will to survive one more hour. It proved that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it crawls forward through the swamp, nameless and unseen. For the Allies, Buna was a harsh awakening. Victory would not come through firepower alone. It would demand adaptation, the reshaping of minds as much as machines. From the mud of New Guinea rose a new kind of soldier, one who fought not only the enemy, but the world itself. And through that suffering, the course of the Pacific War began to change. For Japan, Buna was the first whisper of mortality. An empire that believed itself unbreakable met its own reflection, not in defeat by superior numbers, but by the limits of flesh and faith. The jungle made no distinction between bravery and obedience. It consumed both equally. And for those who stood in that rain, the soldiers who carried on when everything human had already been taken from them, Buna became more than a battle. It was a haunting. Years later, they would wake in the dark, tasting the same damp air, hearing the rain on tin roofs and thinking, for a moment, they were back there again. Today, the ghosts of Buna rest beneath the palms, their names fading, their stories almost gone. But in every soldier's mud-soaked boot, in every rusted rifle unearthed by the sea, their struggle still speaks. It tells us that victory is never clean, that war's greatest cost is carried by those who survive it. And in that quiet truth, Buna still breathes, a reminder that even in triumph, the jungle never truly lets go.